I think you're going to say something to follow on with that. Do you want to go up to the lectern or do it from here? You do. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I would like to give a comment based on what Asians experience in Indonesia. Yeah, related to the uncertainty. This uncertainty leads to actually many hesitations on the field, where in the local and national level, they want to know, for example, the indicators. What is the best indicators to deal with the climate change, where we don't know up to what level actually we should tackle that, and and also the target, should we set target? But if we're not set target, then how about the government who will always want to know about our achievement? It's like becoming difficult because of just the uncertainty. Maybe you have a comment to help with this problem.
Thanks very much there. So getting a question in very early on, but I think let's just put that to one side at the moment. I think we want to open up the session to have a discussion with the group as a whole. So I hope people have had some stimulation from what we've seen there. I came away with 3 or 4 fairly sort of broad points from the presentations there, because on the one hand, when I listened to Paula starting off, I felt myself asking, have we really got tools within monitoring and evaluation that are there and already exist to tackle the sorts of challenge that was being raised there? A new challenge in some respects, but yet in a sense, are you saying it was really so very difficult at a technical level from a broader challenge of dealing with poverty and so on? And that makes us think, well, perhaps we are well off, and indeed we can adapt tools that we've got. And to a certain extent, I felt that Gil was sort of reinforcing that, coming up with the approach being used in the Ethiopian project there, essentially, I think interpreting it, a rich text ordinal rating system being used to give, admittedly somewhat subjective and with all sorts of challenges of rolling baselines and so on, but to give a representation of institutional change. But then I think Robbie, to some extent, made me feel less comfortable again, because by raising this question that so much work appears to be split between top-down or bottom-up approaches and not drawing it together, and I find myself thinking, do we really know enough about how institutions or how society needs to change, or indeed can change, in order to begin to seek these appropriate indicators? So I think there's a lot of once again, evaluators, I think, are often in that position of having to put pressure on planners who haven't necessarily got the ideas about how to intervene and therefore what needs to be monitored. So I think at that point, let's see, who would like to come in first, either with some clarification or a question? Please.
Do we need a microphone?
I know. A microphone's on its way. Can you start by just telling us who you are,
Yes.
and then...
I'm Ken Shomitz. I'm with the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. Just as a small advertisement that may be of interest to this group, we've just completed an evaluation of the bank group's work on climate adaptation, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So I wonder if it's okay if I express some reactions, because I found this a very stimulating and interesting talk. I very much like the distinction between the adaptation, filling the adaptation gap, and dealing with the transformational change. I think that this is key to understanding adaptation. And I think the emphasis on adaptation capacity is important, because that's really at the nexus between these two things. There's so much to be done in meeting the adaptation gap, and that involves capacity building. But when we think about what are actually the actions that you need to take today to meet the challenges of 30 years from now, the problem is that because of the uncertainty, it's not always clear what those actions are. But one thing for sure is that many of the institutions that will be needed take decades to build up. So building the adaptation capacity is clearly something that falls into both those camps. Now that said, I think this issue about is this any different, is this macro-micro distinction any different from what we deal with in say, fighting poverty? I'm not sure it is. It is very different. And I think one thing to think about is whether is the need for both capacity measures and performance measures at all these levels, from the micro to the macro. So let me just give one illustration, and then I'll shut up. So one of the clearly one of the things that's important both today and for the future is agricultural adaptation. We know that crop conditions are going to change. We don't know exactly how they're going to change. So that because there's such uncertainty about precipitation. So what we do know is that there's tremendous need in the agricultural research, development, and extension system to be able to adapt to whatever the climate throws us. So that being said, one could go to the people who specialize in studying agricultural extension services and say, well, how do you know if your agricultural extension service is working, both in terms of its capacity and in terms of its ability to develop to deliver innovations in the field? Just as a sidelight, there's a really interesting group called digitalgreen.org, which is working in India. They deliver innovations basically using YouTube, and it's a self-documenting, self-evaluating system. I highly recommend it. So, digitalgreen.org. It's a fascinating thing. So you could imagine looking at many kinds of interventions at the grassroots level. Some of them agricultural, some of them safety net, and then a performance measure at the top level is looking at household welfare. So when the droughts hit, does hunger increase or does it not increase? I mean, this is being measured in Ethiopia in the Productive Safety Nets program, so the tools for this exist. That's kind of the best single measure of current resilience, and one would think that if you're doing well with current resilience, that's a good harbinger for the future. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you very much. Nancy.
Really interesting, thanks. And thanks, Ken. We're looking forward to reading that. This has been a long time in the coming, hasn't it? A year ago you were putting this together, too, yes. I wanted to raise Ken's last point on resilience. The resilience literature now that talks about breaking down institutions in order to create new kinds of institutions. So I think we're a bit stuck in the whole sort of adaptive planning, and I think some of the institutions that exist are just never going to be able to do the kind of transformational change that's needed. And I'd love your thoughts on that, because we keep throwing little bits of money here and there and effort into trying to make some institutions do things just completely differently, and they're just not set up to think that way. So do we need to challenge ourselves on the institutional development side? How do we do this with existing mindsets and existing institutions?
Thank you. My name is Osvaldo Feinstein. I appreciate the presentations. Now, this is an area where a lot of work has been going on. One of the key programs of the CGR is dealing with climate change, and a lot of work has been going on there in developing pathways to climate change. I think it would be worthwhile to use that, particularly because also the type of indicators that you mentioned there are not really indicators. Reducing uncertainty. I mean, these are things for which you need indicators. Unfortunately, this has been elaborated. In fact, in the Alexandria conference that Nancy also and Ken participated on climate change and evaluating climate change and development, I don't know if you have seen the publication and the work that has been done. on several of these issues, there are indicators and sources there, and there has been a follow-up on that. So that's an advantage because you don't need to start from scratch. Now, in the case of Ethiopia, when you were presenting the different components, I was struck when you lumped together planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And as Derek pointed out, people in monitoring and evaluation have been putting pressure on those that are in planning, and for many years, there were components and units of planning, monitoring, and evaluation, which seemed to make sense. But when this was assessed, it was clear that it was convenient to separate the functions. So I think that may be of some use to you. I wanted to ask you about what you said concerning the control group. To what extent are these really control groups or comparison groups? Because it has to do with the way in which you select the organizations that participate in the fund. And by the way, what would be useful is to think in terms of the synergies between the fund and the innovation centers. So it's not only the evaluation of an evaluation system for one and for the other, but also the type of linkages between both, because that can really provide insights that are valuable for Ethiopia and for other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Osvaldo. Gil, you might want to respond to that, but perhaps do you want to do now or take another comment or something? What would you prefer?
Well, I'd like to respond to that.
Good. Why don't we do that and then come on to Anthony?
Thank you. I mean, I should just mention, obviously in a very short time I didn't cover all of the kind of things that we're trying to do, but that point about synergies is very important, and that's something we are indeed trying to capture, various indicators. The issue of the control group, I think probably I'm overstating it to really call it control group, because it's just our best attempt to try and identify one ministry that is technically, it's got its climate resilience unit being formed, but it has no direct linkage with this program. So what we might find, of course, is that there's all sorts of learning linkages that are formed. So despite having no technical association with the DFID funded work, in practice they're brought into the discussions and there's all sorts of linkages formed. So it's not really a control group, but what that will show us will be actually the program's doing quite well, because it's managing to spread its kind of effects beyond the boundaries. But we'll have to see. On that, your earlier point on the lumping together of planning M&E, yes, it's an interesting point. And I think, it's something I'll go back and discuss with my colleague who put together the 4 dimensions of the OCAM, Ursula Blackshaw, and see, we'll think that through, but it's certainly a good point to raise.
Thank you. Okay. Hans-Peter and then Andrew. Down at the front of you first.
My name is Hans Melby. I'm from NORAD's Evaluation Department, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. We are, among other things, doing what we call a real-time evaluation of the Norwegian Forest and Climate Initiative. My question here is more on, obviously it makes sense to prepare or increase resilience to all kinds of phenomena that the farmers, for instance, face in the real world, of different climate or different weather from year to year. And just take an example, in Bangladesh, the difference between high tide and low tide is maybe 1 meter or 2 meters. The difference between the dry season and the rainy season is 2 or 4 or 6 meters or 8 meters, depending on where you are. There are huge man-made changes made to the country all the time with road construction and city development, industrial development, and you have a population that is extremely well at adapting to different conditions. So my question is, what's the difference between that kind of resilience that we want to increase all the time and what we call resilience to climate change, which we know so little about? That's my big question mark when I listen to the interventions. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Hans-Peter. Quite a big question. Paola, would you like to say something in response before we take another question? Why not?
Speaking from the literature and what the research says about resilience, in that I would completely agree with you that excuse me, some people in certain countries have to be resilient every day and adapt every day to new circumstances and new challenges. Africa, for example, has been adapting and being resilient to climate forever and ever. But I would argue that what is new now is that the changes that we need to see are far bigger and faster and have to happen faster than what we've seen before. And that's the challenge with climate change. We are going to see more extreme events and more changes in the climate variability than we've ever seen before. So it's the speed that is different. Second, we do not know what is coming, and therefore there are many what we call the unknowns of what is coming. And finally, the understanding of resilience that we can also see in different organizations. And resilience has been a contentious word because some people understand resilience as the capacity of bouncing back. So a disaster happens and I'm able, or I have the capacity to go back to where I was before. Whereas now we are understanding resilience more from a transformational approach, and it's not just about bouncing back, but it's about going to another state with a better quality of standard of living. So that would be from the definitional dimension, if I can speak in terms of resilience, which links to the comment done before between the adaptation deficit and resilience. And unfortunately, what is happening in the academic realm and in the research realm, which is a lot of debate and definitions and so forth and so on, we do not see that happening on the ground or at the institutional level. And still people are engaging with very conventional understandings of resilience itself. And the first slide that it presented, adaptation was understood as a coping strategy. So the evaluation of the PSNP that you were talking about, saying, well, actually, if people are able to cope to a particular drought today or flood today, they will be able to cope in the future. But resilience, building resilience, is not about coping. Yeah, it's about transforming and improving the standard of living. And therefore, we see that dichotomy of conventional thinking, because it's easier to measure how people are coping today. It's not that difficult to measure if that's going to be sustainable in the next 10 years to come. And we can actually see how in the adaptation debate, the thinking at the beginning was, well, actually we need to adapt and therefore coping strategies. Then there was this understanding that, well, it's not just about coping, but it's also about responding to it in a different way. And now we are talking about transformation. The problem from the evaluation perspective is that because we have not seen indicators or efforts trying to grasp those issues, especially the donor community is now moving to a new word, which is innovation. People are, we can see that the donor community especially are tired of speaking about resilience and adaptations because they are too abstract and we don't know We still don't know how to measure them. But we can measure innovation, as you were saying, because we can measure agricultural production, and we can measure technologies, and we can measure where those technologies are being developed, and we can measure how those technologies. But if we look at the literature and all the lessons that have been learned, for example, in agriculture, we know that technology is not the solution. We've been innovating in technology for the last 50 years, and still you have huge poverty issues in many countries. So do we move towards innovation and things that are easy somehow to measure in the short term, or do we really want to go towards building resilience and trying to understand what does that mean in practice? And that's why emphasizing the idea of processes and intermediate outcomes rather than trying to find the silver bullet and trying to measure something that almost no one knows what is it exactly that we are talking about in practice.
Let me just come in there. Before we take another question, I won't forget that. I just think I'm quite pleased in a way that we've come on to this resilience point, because it is such a critical issue about having not only a common language, but a common agreement over the meaning of the terminology. And I think, clearly that's an important part of policy development and interventions, but it's even more so for evaluation. If we are to use constructs such as resilience and adaptation, we have to have clarity over the meaning, because we can't develop indicators and we can't develop ways of measurement without having got there. So I think, Robbie, do you want to come in with something there before we... But also I would say if anybody wants to raise a point very much on that resilience terminology definition, let's do that before taking any other wider points.
Yeah, just to sort of pick up on what Paula's thinking and again move into the ideas of sort of just postulating about this. I think what's different about potentially climate change M&E is related to the concept of transformational change. And if you accept that humanity is facing potentially a perfect storm of massive resource constraints, population growth, and declining or disrupted climate, then the problem suddenly becomes not one of looking down at them, the communities and the households, and looking up at the institutions, but actually how do we measure or gauge how society as a whole is adapting and developing the resilience to address the threats. And that's where I think, and perhaps adaptive capacity isn't the right terminology because it's too focused at local adaptive capacity. But I think because of the specific or the nature of the threat, we need to avoid this dichotomy or overcome this dichotomy of looking up at sort of institutions and looking down at households, and actually not looking at ourselves, i.e. societies in general, and specifically the knowledge, attitudes and practices that are required in terms of society as a whole to address the threat. And that's what I think is currently missing from lots of the indicator frameworks which look at agricultural outputs or those sorts of things. They don't actually tell you whether we as a community are gearing up to address the nature of the threat.
Anything very specific on this before we continue on? You want Piva? Let's hear from Piva and then over to you.
Just a few addition about the adaptive capacity. We have to remember that community are divided into the poor and vulnerable and the less poor and vulnerable. And it means that when we say about adaptive capacity, then we again have to define and maybe make definition of what they need from these two groups. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question in practical terms. And my experience fairly recently was evaluating an innovative microfinance program in northeast India. And we had no idea that there would be any climate change dimension to it at all. But it transpired that because of the serious floods they'd had, some of the money had been lent to help cope with floods and adapt for avoiding future problems. Now, we haven't actually done any evaluation focused on that. But it strikes me that some of the indicators that we have already for general development evaluation will be very useful. But we are missing indicators that would tell us how people are changing their livelihoods, changing their practices to avoid similar situations in future. I think we can't draw on the standard set of indicators for that particular question.
Now, Nancy, were you going to, or Hans-Peter? Hans-Peter, yeah. Sorry, Andrea, we're not ignoring it.
Just to this again, I mean, I don't disagree that we might be facing serious climate change. We don't know about it. That's not an argument for saying that they won't happen. But just to illustrate my point, that is, you had cyclones in Bangladesh. I mean, some people in Bangladesh probably say that there are more cyclones now, but I think pretty many people say that no, they were worse off. We had the same cyclones 30 or 100 years ago. I think it's fair to argue that cyclones that killed 200,000 or 300,000 people in a night, 40 years ago, they killed 2,000 or 3,000 a couple of years ago. Just to show, whatever you call it, adaptation, resilience to changing nature. And during that period of 40 years, the Bay of Bengal has, the sea level in the Bay of Bengal may have risen 6 millimeters, 0.6 centimeters. I mean, that's not the problem people face. So my argument, I guess, is that yes, very serious things might happen. It's wise to prepare for them and to evaluate our preparation for them, but at the same time it's extremely important to do that together with the people that are concerned. In institutions maybe, internationally maybe, but at the ground level as well, because they might know things that we don't know. And whether you call it resilience or development, it's good. Thank you.
Sorry, no, I completely agree with you. Sorry, I didn't get your point. And if we go down to the local level, they don't differentiate between adaptation, resilience, livelihoods, food security, poverty. For them, it's just about life, right? So it's the structures and the institutions that we have in place who create those, sectoral approaches and expertise, and who are our own institutions who make that holistic vision of, resilience so difficult. That's not the problem at the local level. That's a problem, at high levels. And again, it's not just about coping with that cyclone, but the people in Bangladesh, their main concern is their livelihoods and their incomes. So, if we want to build adaptive capacity and for them to have the capacity to adapt to whatever comes, that's what we need to address, which brings it back to, development efforts. And that's why, we need to look at it holistically, but that's already happening at the local level. The problem is, my understanding, at the institutional and structural level, which goes back to the comment that Nancy was mentioning before. Well, actually, maybe we will have institutions in place that will not be able to transform themselves to address such an issue. Well, I think that's what we are seeing. And we are seeing small changes in very small institutions at the local level, because for them it's easier to understand and the structures are less rigid. But we have to see what the big players have to say. And again, the winners, don't forget about the winners and the losers.
Good, thank you. Let's come back to Andrea for...
There's a little sort of link, I think. I'd like to talk about the indicator side of it. But I think the language of transformational change, rather than talking about adaptation, is actually helpful in this context. Because essentially what we need to be kind of tracking in the sort of short and the immediate term, and then in the longer term, is the transformational capacity. And I think we need to look at it, and that diagram that Robbie put up is very helpful in sort of being able to track that at kind of community, organisational and societal level. And we're talking about sort of short and long-range sort of events and tracking systems. How this relates, I think, to monitoring and evaluation is in a number of ways. At the moment, we seem to be kind of globally sort of thinking that if we set up a kind of a net of indicators, we'll somehow be able to kind of pick this up and track this. I don't think that's the case necessarily. I think that on one level, there's a lot of data that's already out there and being collected. Administrative data, lots of survey data, which I don't think is being mined properly for climate purposes. I think if we took a hard look at that and identified some gaps in the administrative and survey data that's taking place, we might be able to tweak some of the administrative and survey data, and that would allow us to track some of these changes over time and pinpoint things that are, or probably at national or sub-regional sort of level, things that are happening sort of well and effectively in areas where we have a problem. Because this is in effect a kind of global public good, so it's actually dealing with it through that framework which will help. I think the other sort of level is being better able to understand this at a sort of micro level, the project level, and the project can be community adaptation, it can be organisational development projects. I'm not sure, talking to Gil's point, that indicators are the sole answer here. Within DFID, we're talking about how to embed an understanding of climate change issues as a mainstreamed issues within our evaluations. We've only just started talking about that, but actually sort of bringing in, as we talked earlier, Paolo was in the session I was in earlier, talking about the gender and equity dimensions of programmes, embedding climate change considerations in a reflexive way in evaluation practice may actually be a better way forwards, because then you'll start to create bodies of evaluative, and I think research evidence that allow you to start to interpret in terms of what's happening, but also to start to learn from what's actually working and what's not.
Okay, thank you very much. Some good ideas there. First Nancy and then gentleman at the back.
I think there's a real edge to this that needs to be acknowledged, and the disaster field, I think, has really highlighted it, and it's the build back better principle. And because if your life is miserable, it's not just putting the slum back up, it's how do you leapfrog over that? And so somewhere embedded in the tracking of this, we have to be tracking, are we mapping against inequities where they exist now, against miserable lives, and saying, you know, if this stuff's going to happen, how do we respond to it in a way that influences the way urban planning is done, the way private sector makes decisions about 5-star hotels on the coast? You know, you look in Thailand now, the 5-star hotels are back. They're, you know, they shouldn't be there. You know, so how is that happening, and how do we parallel the local? Local people can only adapt so much. I mean, the real change has to happen from the rich and the powerful that have the ability to make big infrastructure changes and big policy decisions. And what are we doing to bring coalitions of players together on that level? You know, I think people are asking a lot of local people to adapt to things that are, you know, being brought upon them by others.
Back first and then back.
Hello, my name is Leon Hermans. I'm from the Netherlands. Thank you for these presentations and this discussion. I have one point that I was wondering about. It was triggered by Gil Yaron's presentation, but it follows up on the comment just now made by Nancy McPherson. You were working on institutions, but you were discussing organizational capacity, whereas you could also think of institutions as something beyond an organization, and it is perhaps also the way these different organizations are connected and coordinate or do not coordinate and strategically interact to create winners and losers. And especially in connecting also the micro and the macro, this seems also a relevant aspect or dimension, and I was wondering how you are tackling that in your frameworks and in your work.
Thank you very much. It's a very good point, and indeed we recognise that. So, treating institutions as rules of the game and networks and things like that, we have actually, or are in the process of designing something which is similar to that OCAM measure, multidimensional measure, but designed for institutions. It's just a bit early on in the programme for us to be testing that, but we're working towards that. So, for example, to examine new collaborative ventures between academics and the private sector, for example. And so, yes, we are going to try and capture that.
Good, so we'll hear from that at the conference a year from now or so. If you want a quick comment, and then we'll come down the front here. Sure.
Yeah, just a small comment to Andrea and Nancy, because I think it's two things of the same coin, two faces of the same coin. Just 2 months ago, I think, I was working with DFID Tanzania, screening their portfolio and trying to mainstream climate change into their wider development programs. And I think that's a very good example of how indicators can actually help in bringing in climate change into the development agenda. And it's been we're still learning a lot from it. But again, it's stepping back from the evaluation link and bringing, as Nancy was saying, the planning lens and say, well, wait a minute, how are we going to deal with that? What does that mean for my planning? What does that mean for my investments before I jump and start thinking about how am I going to evaluate that? And you actually have organizations arguing that it's way too early to think about evaluation of climate change adaptation efforts. We are not at that stage yet. You have people arguing that and saying, well, actually, let's focus on our planning and our monitoring systems first. And once we grasp out those, then let's start thinking about how do we evaluate them. But I can also give you another example. We developed a guideline on planning, monitoring, and evaluating for integrated pathways that was not just looking at adaptation, but looking at what we are talking here is about development, it's about standards of living, it's about climate change, and the whole basket of indicators. But as soon as, and that's real life, as soon as we started talking with donors, national governments, CVOs, as soon as we mentioned M&E, they were completely put off by the idea of it. It's like M&E, either you deal with my M&E officer or, that's nothing to do with me, or you're going to talk to me about indicators. So we realized that actually, if instead of talking about M&E, we started talking about planning, screening, reflection, learning, they would sit with us and they would start thinking on the adaptation portfolio through a development lens. So sometimes, the jargon that we use and how we approach our work can make such a huge difference. So it's actually, at the end of the day, we realize more and more that it's about changing mindsets and ways of working, and that's the biggest challenge. How evaluations can contribute to break that, I think